Hi, everybody, and welcome to Chapter 7. In Chapter 7, we are going to focus on sexual victimization. The first category of sexual victimization that we're going to focus on is to define rape, forcible rape. And forcible rape is the non-consensual act of any oral, anal, or digital penetration or genital penetration where no consent has been provided. Forcible rape are going to be instances in which the offender uses threat, physical violence, or threat of physical violence in order to have non-consensual penetration. There's also drug and alcohol facilitated rape. And drug and alcohol facilitated rape is when an individual is given a drug or alcohol or some other intoxicant like GHB or Rohypnol to facilitate the rape, to get the individual to lose control of their faculties, of their cognitive abilities, their physical function in order to facilitate the rape. Incapacitated rape is a little bit different. It's somewhat similar. Incapacitated rape is where an individual cannot consent on the basis of their self-induced alcohol or drug use. So there's still alcohol and drugs involved, but it's the individual who is being assaulted chose to use those intoxicants. They weren't given by the offender. Because they chose to use these intoxicants and got themselves to a position of losing consciousness or not having all of their awareness or faculties, or they fall asleep, this is the instance in which the offender will engage in penetration where there's no consent, and therefore this is what we call incapacitated rape. And an example of this is the Brock Turner case, the Stanford pre-Olympic athlete who was at a frat party with another young woman who was drinking. She got intoxicated, started to pass out. He dragged her passed out body over to a dumpster where he forcibly raped her while she was unconscious. Two other students riding bikes rode by, saw what was happening, interrupted the rape. Brock Turner got up and sprinted away. That's an example of incapacitated rape. There's also what we call statutory rape. And statutory rape is when an individual under 18 years old has had sexual intercourse with an adult. This can be forcible or not forcible, but no matter what, it's always statutory rape. Basis of an individual being a minor, being under 18 years old, means that they cannot legally provide consent. They can verbally consent. Yes, I want to do this. I'm willing to partake, but they do not have the legal ability to give you that consent. Therefore, it is a strict liability crime, meaning that anybody who engages in sexual activity with a minor, even if they told you they were over the age, even if they had, a fake ID that gave you a legal age, you are strictly culpable. They are a minor. They can lie all they want. You're the one that's legally culpable. So if they are under the age, you are strictly liable and responsible. It is considered rape. There are other forms of victimization that are not considered rape. So the first is going to be sexual coercion, and this is going to be any emotional or psychological tactics such as providing rewards or threats of non-physical punishment in exchange for penetration of the offenders with the offender's penis, mouth, tongue, digits, inanimate objects, or etc. So an example of that would be like a boss is going to come to you and say, I will give you this promotion in exchange for this sexual exchange. Right. Unwanted sexual contact are going to be instances in where a person is touched in an erogenous zone without consent, but there's no penetration of any kind. So unwanted touching, groping, rubbing, licking, etc. All of those things are unwanted sexual contact. But I do want to make a point that there's no physical force used. There's no physical force used in unwanted sexual contact. Formal measures of sexual crimes are not at all representative of the actual number and amount of sex crimes that occur. This is a massively underreported area of victimization and crime for a myriad of reasons. People are embarrassed that this happened to them. People don't want to go through the process of having to talk about this with strangers like law enforcement prosecutors. They don't want to get up on the stand and testify in front of all kinds of people. So there's a lot of reasons that people don't report sexual crimes, which means the numbers are far greater than we currently know. Risk factors for sexual victimization are as follows. Being a female obviously gives you the greatest risk of sexual victimization than males experience at all stages of life, regardless of age. Okay, males under age 12 are at the highest risk for sexual victimization at any point in a male's life. Okay, females are at the highest risk of sexual victimization in their late teens and early 20s, which interestingly enough coincides with college, right? Which is a lot of people, both male and female. It's the first time away from mom and dad's house, and it's also a deep dive into alcohol, which we've talked about, alcohol and drug use, increasing one's ability to become victimized. So that should make sense. Unemployed females have greater risk of sexual victimization. Alcohol use, like we say, it always increases the risk of victimization of all kinds. Living in urban locations increases risk of sexual victimization, and being an African American individuals have higher risk for sexual victimization than do members of other races. Interestingly, there's an interesting caveat here because typically urban locations are where crime is, the highest risk, like that's the highest geographical risk factor. But it's not only that case here with sexual assault and sexual victimization. We see that rural residents are actually at greater risk of falling victim to forcible rape and sexual victimization than people who live in other geographic locations. That's different. That is sort of a because by and large, the biggest geographic risk factor for every category of crime is living in a city that is densely populated, where there's a lot of social disorganization, where there's a lot of poverty, with the exception of this category of forcible rape. It actually proliferates in rural locations. Arrested offenders of forcible rape are most commonly white males between the ages of 25 and 34. And of all the arrested offenders of forcible rape, only 3% constitute women. So I do want to dispel that myth that women can't be forcible offenders. They can be. It's not common. It's very rare, but they do absolutely exist. Rape is an incredibly personal crime, meaning that the offender and the assailant are overwhelming numbers. They usually know each other. It doesn't mean that stranger rapes don't happen. They do. They're just very rare. The bulk of rape and sexual assault is either somebody you know well, somebody you're in a relationship with or were in a relationship with, or somebody that you are acquainted with. 1/3 of all rapes are perpetrated by an intimate partner. 1/3 of all rapes are perpetrated by an acquaintance, and 1/3 of all rape victims are physically assaulted in addition to the rape. So they are physically damaged in order for the rape to be carried out. 1/3 of all rapes utilize weapons, and the most commonly used weapon utilized to perpetrate a rape is a firearm. Victim reactions to rape are wide and varied. Obviously, anger, fear, frustration, sadness, shame, guilt, embarrassment are all common. Some may not view it as an assault. Some may look at the situation as a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a bad night where two people had too much to drink. And therefore, they are less likely to pursue formal reactions to the crime. Among many women who choose not to report the assault to authorities, most rape victims will disclose their victimization to somebody else. They will talk about it to somebody. And of those self-reports, 75% of women who disclose that victimization to somebody else have reported receiving a negative response, being not believed, being questioned about what their role in the rape was, etc., which is in part why this is such an underreported crime, right? That people get negative reactions, and it is widely known and understood that victims who come forth are not received with understanding and caring, compassion, etc. Let's talk about some resistance strategies. Rape victims demonstrate resistance categories that will fall into one of the 4 following categories. So the first is going to be forceful physical resistance, and that's going to be things like punching, biting, shoving, clawing, etc., physically combating their assailant to try and prevent the rape or interrupt the rape. Non-forceful strategies involve things like fleeing, running away from the offender, pulling away from the offender, just trying to put distance between them. Forceful verbal strategies involve things like yelling to get the offender to stop, just to try and startle them and get through to them, but also yelling to draw attention from bystanders, that the more noise you're making, the more likely people are to come and look what's going on to interrupt the ability for the offender to perpetrate the rape. There's also non-forceful strategies that are verbal, things like pleading and begging with the offender to stop, trying to talk to the offender to try and, talk sense to them, get through to them. Those are all, reactions on the part of the victim. I want you to be familiar with something called the parity hypothesis, and that is that the victim will have the greatest success of resistance in a rape situation utilizing the level of force that matches the level of the aggression being put forth by the offender. So the more aggressive the offender is, and the more aggressive the victim is in response, the more likely she is to resist a rape situation. So if somebody's not being terribly forceful, if they are forcing, but they're not being terribly forceful, the best advice for the victim is to increase her level of resistance. Because we see when there's more resistance given than being put forth on the force end, women are more likely to be able to resist and engage in self-protective action. Tonic immobility is something that happens. It's a common response to sexual assault. And this is when the victim, goes into a state of a physical state where, there's an adrenaline burst, but instead of fight or flight, they have immobility. They might tremor. They might shake. They might have a fixed stare, an inability to, engage verbally, to scream, to shout. They sort of freeze up. We used to think that adrenaline bursts were characterized by fight or flight, but research has now told us that there is a third reaction. It's fight, flight, and freeze, right? And that's what tonic immobility is. It's a reaction to the adrenaline burst where your body says freeze for survival. And that is what up to 40% of rape victims experience, that tonic immobility. Consequences of sexual assault and victimization. Obviously, there's mental and emotional damage there. There's going to be PTSD, depression, anxiety. There might be emotional detachment. Suicidal ideation is very common among rape victims. Self-harm is also very common. Cutting is very common. Intimate relationships end up being very damaged. So if you are in a relationship, whether it's a marriage or, a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, whatever, rape victims obviously don't want to jump back into sexual relationships after being forcibly traumatized sexually. This can erode the relationship because it's, people can't understand, and the partner's trying to protect, help heal, but the victim may need to just be left alone entirely. It's not uncommon for intimate partner relationships to dissolve unfortunately in the face of this kind of victimization. Other demographics of victims, 3% of males will be raped in their lifetime. It's far less than females, but it is absolutely still a thing. And 3% of the male population is still thousands and thousands of victims, not to be taken lightly, not to be ignored. Interestingly, sadly, our armed forces have a noteworthy problem with male-on-male rape that is utilized as a form of hazing, a form of dominance, a form of humiliation, a form of control. There's even greater stigma on male victims of rape than there are on female victims. Very few male victims will ever report their victimization out of shame, humiliation. There's often the fear that people will think or assume that they are homosexual. Otherwise, why would a man have raped another man unless you are giving off homosexual tendencies, which is obviously a silly nonsense perspective, but it is something that keeps male victims from reporting the crime, from talking about the crime, from being able to properly heal from the crime. The LGBTQ community is also at risk of falling victim to sexual assault. Researchers theorize that this group of individuals has the greatest amount of stress, which is likely to provoke increased drug and alcohol use and self-medication, which makes them even more likely to fall victim to sexual assaults. There are different legal approaches to rape. Okay, number one are rape shield victims. We didn't always have these. Prior to rape shield victim laws, it was really a really hard thing. I mean, it's always a really hard thing for a rape victim to go through a prosecution. But the defense attorney would, the typical approach was to attack the character of the victim, splash their face all over the media, and try and break them with stress and public attention, try to defame them and get anti-public sentiment against the victim. So rape shield laws were introduced that prohibits that defense of using a victim's previous sexual history in court, because the defense would say, well, how many sexual partners have you had prior to this sexual encounter with my client? Oh, you had sexual relations with 15 men before this. Well, obviously you're promiscuous. Obviously you're the problem, not the offender, not my defendant. Those laws now shield defense attorneys from being able to do that. Also from identifying them in the media, identifying their where they live, where they work, etc. There are also affirmative consent laws. Some jurisdictions have passed laws requiring verbal consent must be uttered in order for a sexual exchange to occur, so to make sure everybody is clear about who's okay with what, and that if verbal consent has not been obtained, that it is legit under the law, it's going to be viewed as a forcible rape. HIV, STI testing. Some states now require convicted sexual offenders to get tested for sexually transmitted diseases and HIV. because we know they have a history of sexual offending. You don't get to keep that medical information secret because you forcibly victimize people, not only by sexually assaulting them, but you're now exposing them to illness as well. So some states have legislatively mandated that if you are convicted of a sexual crime and you end up on the registration list, you have to be tested so that we can provide notification to victims and say, yes or no, yes, your assailant is HIV positive. You need to get tested. Or no, your HIV, or excuse me, no, your assailant was not HIV positive. At least we can give you that peace of mind. I spoke briefly about sex offender notification and registration. This requires that convicted sex offenders register with multiple state and federal agencies. These registrations can be accessed by the public. You can look up any neighborhood, any geographic locale in any part of the United States, and you can see how many sexual offenders live in the area, what their offenses are, who they are, etc. Legal mandates require that anybody who has to register cannot be in 1,000 feet of any school, preschool, public park, or any place where children congregate. This is done obviously to protect all victims, previous, and hopefully to prevent future victimization. And one of the other things that we've done is we have created sex crimes units in law enforcement agencies that is all they do is manage sex crimes, deal with victims of sexual assault, and they essentially specialize in this area so that they can have the best trained response to sexual victims. They, usually get crisis training that are specific to sexual assaults. They help guide the individual through the process, through evidence collection, through rape kits, through injury care, and they can put the victims in touch with the services that those victims need to heal and move on from the assault. Like we talked about in a previous chapter, medical approaches to rape victims were not always well handled. We used to be charging victims of sexual assault for their rape kits, which was wildly inappropriate. In addition to that, before we really started getting victims advocates to advocate for sexual victims, often when somebody would go to the ER having been sexually assaulted to go get the rape kit, they'd have to wait endlessly. It's like somebody just got violently raped. Do you really think they should have to sit in a waiting room for 4.5 hours before they're taken back for A, care, and B, evidence collection? So now we don't require that we literally put them to the front of the line because they shouldn't have to do that. In addition, in order to do the rape kit properly, you're not allowed to eat, you're not allowed to bathe, you're not allowed to drink for a period of time so that none of the evidence on your body is contaminated. Again, victims shouldn't be put in that position where, hey, we have a long line at the ER, we're not going to get to you for 5 hours, no food, no water. Don't clean yourself up. We shouldn't be putting them through that. So we have changed our approach, and the medical field has changed their approach. And one of the ways that they did that is they created a whole specialized area called SANE, which stands for Sexual Assault Nurse Examiners. And these are nurses who are trained specifically to respond to sexual victims, how to handle them in the forensic exam, how to conduct the evidence collection, but also how to treat them humanely and as the traumatized victims that they are. To make sure that they are being handled, compassionately and gently, and also putting them in touch with the resources that they need, making sure that they get the physical care that they need in the face of their injuries, in addition to collecting evidence, collecting urine and semen samples and pubic hair and all other things. And then, of course, finally, making sure that they get immediate care, testing for pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases and infections so that they can quiet their minds about the assault as soon as possible. What we've seen is that the use of SANEs has had a really positive impact on reported victim experience post-assault. Victims report feeling that they're respected, feeling that they are cared for. And we also see that since we've introduced this program of SANE, where these nurses are specifically trained in evidence collection, we see that the rape kits are conducted better, more accurately, with fewer issues that result in questions of the ability for the offender to get off in court, right? That we train them how to be forensic evidence collectors of these female and male victims. And because they are so well trained, their rape kits are unquestionable when they go to court. Talked about stranger rapes. Let's talk about prosecution. Like I said, stranger rapes are very rare, but they are almost always prosecuted. because they're very easy to prove in court. It's very easy to prove a stranger rape. When two people have never met and they don't know each other, it's very rare that somebody provides sexual consent to a complete and random stranger who forces them with threat and physical violence into sex. So those are almost always prosecuted. Okay. Rapes where victims know the assailant, or rapes where they know the assailant and the victim engaged in what we would call high risk behavior, like drinking alcohol, using drugs, they are the least likely to be prosecuted because there's so much gray area there that you knew each other, you were using alcohol, you were using drugs. Therefore, determining consent is far, far more difficult. And a lot of prosecutors will look at a situation like that and just say, I don't have a slam dunk case here. There's a lot of reasonable doubt that can be introduced because you're friends, because you had a previous relationship, because you have hung out on multiple occasions. I don't have a case. I'm not going to pursue it. Okay. Rape victims are the most direct witness, obviously, to their assault. So they have a really central role in the prosecution of their offender. It's a very difficult role. Cross-examination of a rape victim by a defense attorney is brutal, always, right? It is often traumatic. It is almost always dehumanizing. Once again, this is a reason for underreporting, is that a lot of women are like, I've already been traumatized. I don't want to do it in a courtroom and be traumatized again. So there's a lot of considerations where sexual crimes and sexual victimization is concerned. And finally, prevention. A couple of the things that we can do for women is, in particular, is self-defense training. We've seen that women who are, have self-defense training, are more likely to, stave off a sexual attack. It minimizes sexual assaults. And then, of course, recognition of high risk behaviors that make you vulnerable to sexual assault. We want to educate the public about these are the behaviors that may put you at risk. Let's manipulate the environment and avoid making yourself vulnerable and putting yourself at risk.